Hi, you guys. Welcome back to another edition of History Tea with Professor T. I am Professor T, and that T stands for Tracy Daniel. And in this edition of History Tea with Professor T, we'll be talking about the conservative turn in American politics. We'll talk about Nixon, we'll talk about Carter's administration, as well as the Iran hostage crisis, and then we'll end with Reagan. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with some History Tea with Professor T, talking about Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon was a Republican. Richard Nixon will win the presidency by a pretty narrow margin. The 1950s and 60s in America will witness a conservative rebirth. In 1968, there is backlash among voters who would formally vote Democrat, but they are against black assertiveness that they have been seeing with the civil rights movement and with the Black Power movements, as well as the anti-war demonstrations. So those populations who are against this black assertiveness and who are against the anti-war demonstrations will help to propel Nixon to the White House. Nixon will try to improve American-Soviet relations as well as Chinese relations during his presidency, and will also get the development and creation of some federal agencies. So we'll get the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. The EPA will combat water and air pollution. We get the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, which will send in inspectors into workplaces to ensure that workplaces are safe. And we'll also get the National Transportation Safety Board, which instructed automakers on how to make their cars safer. Nixon will also abolish the Office of Economic Opportunity. The Office of Economic Opportunity coordinated Johnson's war on poverty, so we'll get that gets cut out from Nixon. And Nixon, though, will also index Social Security benefits to inflation. So what does that mean, to index Social Security benefits to inflation? That means that as inflation rises, Social Security benefits will rise as well. So while we're talking about benefits, we'll talk about Nixon and welfare. Where is Nixon and welfare? What happens during Nixon's administration with welfare? So Nixon will propose something called the Family Assistance Plan. The Family Assistance Plan would replace aid to families of dependent children by having the federal government guarantee a minimum income for all Americans. However, this does not gain congressional approval. Again, it does not gain congressional approval. It's during this period in the 1960s that welfare will become associated with black families, and conservative politicians will attack the recipients of welfare, aka black people, as people who prefer to live off the expense of, quote, honest taxpayers. They will criticize people who are on welfare as those who would prefer to live off of the government instead of work, even though in many cases this is not true. But I digress. So while we're talking about some of these issues, let's talk about Nixon and race. So with Nixon and race, it will be a bit of a mixed bag, okay? It's a mixed picture because Nixon will support some people who will support segregation, but it's also under Nixon that we get a lot of busing. And so it's a mixed bag. So let's talk about this. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? So in order to gain support from white Southerners, Nixon will actually nominate two conservative justices who supported segregation. However, they're not approved. And it's also under Nixon that the number of black Southern students who attended integrated schools will rise from 32% to 77%. Okay, it's also under Nixon that we get the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, which would fund black capitalist initiatives. Nixon will also pursue affirmative action programs. So affirmative action programs are programs that had the intended result of upgrading or increasing minority employment, such as the Philadelphia Plan. Okay, the Philadelphia Plan required construction contractors to hire a certain number of minorities. This was initiated by the Secretary of Labor at this time, George Shultz, and it was eventually abandoned for a voluntary program. Now, when Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1969, Nixon will appoint Warren Burger to succeed him. Now, Burger was expected to take the Supreme Court in a pretty conservative direction, but he ends up shocking everyone with some of these court cases. So we will discuss at least, 3 court cases right now. And so the first court case has to do with busing. So what exactly is busing? Busing was a tool of racial integration. It was a tool to achieve integration, and it will become a lightning rod for protests because you'll have white parents who will be determined to keep their children in neighborhood schools, and you'll have others who will move actually to the suburbs during this period, and you have others who will even enroll their children in private schools to keep their children from going to school with black children. But in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education in 1971, in this Supreme Court case, it approved a lower court's plan that required the extensive transportation of students to achieve school integration. Okay, so Burger will kind of shock people with that decision because it was so expected for him to take the court in this really conservative direction. But in this case, they will approve a lower court's decision, a lower court's plan that will require the busing of students, okay? Now, in San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez in 1973, the court ruled that the Constitution did not require equality in school funding. And in Milliken versus Bradley in 1974, it overturned a lower court's decision that required Detroit's white suburbs to enter into the regional desegregation plan. Schools in the North, because of this one, will remain considerably more segregated than schools in the South. So where is the court on affirmative action programs? Affirmative action, especially during this time, is incredibly controversial. Even as affirmative action programs expanded to include women, the Latinx population, the Asian American populations, as well as Native American populations, conservatives will demand that the Supreme Court invalidate these measures. Now, efforts to promote greater employment opportunities for minorities, aka affirmative action, will spawn opposition, and we'll get a few court cases that come out of this as well. In Griggs versus Duke Power Company in 1971, it stated that even racially neutral job requirements were illegal if they operated to exclude minorities. And United Steelworkers of America versus Weber in 1979, it upheld a program that set quotas for the training and hiring of non-white workers in skilled jobs. However, the justices will overall prove pretty hostile to governmental affirmative action policies. In regions of California, or regions of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978, it overturned an admissions program of the University of California that set aside 16 of 100 places in the medical school for minorities. So the court will eventually the Supreme Court justices will prove pretty hostile to governmental affirmative action programs and policies, as we see in that last court case, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978. So now we'll turn and we'll kind of talk about some of the things that are worrying conservatives at this time. And one of those is the continuing sexual revolution. Now, to the alarm of conservatives during this period, during the 1970s, the sexual revolution went from the counterculture to the mainstream. And we even start to see this in movies. In 1978, it was a film called An Unmarried Woman, and it actually portrayed the dissolution of marriage as a triumph for the wife. Not only do we see this in society as a whole, or in I would say, casual society as a whole. We also see it with a number of laws and just in lifestyle changes, period. Divorce rates in the 1970s are higher, as well as marriage ages. People are waiting a little longer to get married. They're getting married a little older in the 1970s. We also see a decline in birth rates in the 1970s due to the availability of birth control and legalized abortions with Roe versus Wade in 1973, which legalized abortions in the nation. In 1972, we get Title IX, and this is something as college students that's very important for you guys to know. Title IX banned sex-based discrimination in higher education and will provide multiple opportunities for women and students in higher education. It's also in 1972 that we get the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act required married women to be given access to credit, as in credit cards, in their own name. So prior to this, married women had to get credit in their husband's name. But the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1972 will require married women to be given access to credit in their own name. It's also during this period that gay and lesbian movements will start to expand and enter more of the mainstream, and this will alarm conservatives. In the 1970s as well, the American Psychiatric Association finally removed homosexuality from its list of mental diseases. So, what about Nixon and politics? What will he do as far as foreign policy? Nixon has some foreign policy victories or some foreign policy triumphs. So one of those things is, for example, he was the first president to visit the Soviet Union. So that's something that's pretty big. While he was in the Soviet Union, he will engage in intense negotiations with the Soviets. And it's out of these negotiations that we get the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, or SALT. SALT froze each country's arsenal of intercontinental missiles that were capable of carrying nuclear warheads. And we also get the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which banned the development of systems designed to intercept incoming missiles. So those are some of Nixon's triumphs. However, like many presidents before him, we are still in a Cold War. We are still fighting communism. So Nixon will still cozy up to some, I'll call them unsavory characters, in order to stop the spread of communism. He will still undermine governments that were deemed dangerous to American strategic and economic interests. He will funnel arms to dictatorial pro-American regimes in Iran, the Philippines, and in South Africa. In Chile, after socialist Salvador Allende was elected president in 1970, the CIA actually worked with his opponents to destabilize the regime. Allende was actually murdered in a military coup in 1973, and a dictator was installed after him. Nixon's administration knew of the coup, but they failed to warn Allende, and not only did that happen, they would continue to back the dictator despite his brutal policies. Because in American politics, we will cozy up and rub elbows with people who were kind of unsavory during this kind of Cold War era, as long as they were anti-communist. Now, despite some of Nixon's foreign policy triumphs, there's one issue that will not go away, and that issue is Vietnam. By the time we get to Nixon's election, we've been in Vietnam for years. There is plummeting morale. And now, for a little bit of tea, people are starting to find out what's going on in Vietnam. People are starting to find out that, oops, we've been misled about Vietnam. In 1969, the New York Times published the details of the My Lai massacre of 1968. The My Lai massacre was when a company of American troops killed 350 South Vietnamese civilians. After this happens, Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty of directing the atrocity. And after this My Lai massacre, public support for the war begins to decline. In 1971, the New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers. So the Pentagon Papers were leaked by a former government worker named Daniel Ellsberg. And the Pentagon Papers essentially say that Americans have been misled about the war. Not only have Americans been misled about the war, but it traced American involvement in Vietnam all the way back to World War II. And it revealed how president after president after president had misled Americans about the war in Vietnam. So when Nixon gets to office in 1968, when he's running for president, Nixon says that he is running with a secret plan to end the war. And as soon as he takes office, he has a plan that he calls Vietnamization. Vietnamization was a plan where American troops would be gradually withdrawn from Vietnam, with the South Vietnamese gradually doing more of the fighting, backed by American bombing. However, not only does it not limit the war, it doesn't limit the anti-war movement. Social changes, all the social changes that are happening at home with the anti-war movement, the peace movement, the Black Power movement, all of that is happening in the military as well. And in 1971, thousands of soldiers actually deserted the army. Now, as the war escalated, protests will erupt on college campuses because the college exemption from the draft had ended at this point. So because of this college exemption from the draft, that means that the burden of the fighting fell to the poor. So the army was predominantly composed of poor, working class whites and minorities. As a matter of fact, of the 2.5 million Americans who served in the military in Vietnam, 80% came from poor and working class families. But there is, I guess, one okay thing that comes out of Vietnam, and that's the War Powers Act in 1973. The War Powers Act stated that the president had to seek congressional approval before committing troops overseas. Okay? Now, in 1973, Nixon negotiated a settlement in Vietnam where we would get peace. So the Paris Peace Agreement left the South Vietnamese government in place. However, by the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese would launch their final offensive, and the U.S. did not intervene with this North Vietnamese offensive except to evacuate the American embassy. So Vietnam, after North Vietnam launches this offensive, Vietnam becomes unified under communist control. The Vietnam War is seen or viewed as the only war that the U.S. has lost. It was a huge economic cost. The Vietnam cost hundreds of millions of dollars. There was a huge social cost because it will undermine American confidence in institutions. It will have a huge, it will be a military and political disaster, and the human cost was massive. About 58,000 Americans will die in Vietnam, and about 3 to 4 million Vietnamese were killed in the Vietnam War. Out of Vietnam, the U.S. will, and I will say the politicians and constituents will have this Vietnam syndrome, as it's called. This Vietnam syndrome is a phenomenon where people are against armed conflicts, where people believe that the U.S. needs to be really reluctant to commit forces or commit armed forces overseas. Okay? So that is the end of part one. I'll see you in just a minute with some history tea with part two. We'll start off with the election of 1972. So stay tuned for part two.